Neo-Marxism seems to be a theory that is designed to cause those who accept it to develop or at least functionally mimic a paranoid personality disorder. Welcome back to MindMatters, everyone. I'm Harrison Cayley, joined as usual by Elan Martin, Adam Daniels, and Luke Koch. Today is part 2 of our discussion of James Lindsay's book, Race Marxism. Last week we talked about critical race theory itself, the first chapters of the book, a bit of the history and origins of it, what it is, what the kind of main tenets of its belief structure are. And we got a bit into what Lindsay calls the proximate ideological origins in critical theory, like Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, those kind of guys. We didn't get into too much detail on them. We'll maybe talk a little bit more about them today, but also the deep ideological roots, which he gets into in chapter 5, I believe, 4 or 5, where he goes back to Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx. So we'll talk a bit more about probably just Marx and Hegel, and then how it all kind of fits together, and then just wherever else we go, because I've got some other things, related things to get to as well. Maybe before diving into those deep roots, just to go back to Marcuse and kind of wrap that up a bit, I wanted to read some, well, I'll start out with something funny. This is from Marcuse's an essay on liberation. And this is, well, I'll just read the paragraph and then I'll say who it reminds me of. We'll see if this reminds you of anyone. Okay, so Marcuse writes, thus, should I preface this with something? What does Lindsay say? Okay, he's talking about in Neo-Marxism, rather than a great proletarian revolution, Marcuse envisioned a great refusal that would usher in a liberation movement towards socialism. And then he said that this great refusal, a reference to Dante's Inferno, would take antinomian and clownish forms, he said, and therefore have something of a subversive anti-aesthetic and anti-morality to them. So he writes, Marcuse, thus, in some sectors of the opposition, the radical protest tends to become antinomian, anarchistic, and even non-political. Here is another reason why the rebellion often takes on the weird and clownish forms which get on the nerves of the establishment. In the face of the gruesomely serious totality of institutionalized politics, satire, irony, and laughing provocation become a necessary dimension of the new politics. The contempt for the deadly esprit de sérieux, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which permeates the talkings and doings of the professional and semi-professional politicians, appears as contempt for the values which they profess while destroying them. The rebels revive the desperate laughter and the cynical defiance of the fool as means for demasking the needs of the serious ones who govern the whole. So, of course, Marcuse is a hardcore leftist, and the only thing I could think of when reading that paragraph was Trump. Like, it's the perfect, Trump, like clownish, cynical defiance of the fool that doesn't take politics seriously and just insults all of the serious politicians. Well, Marcuse actually predicted Trump, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum than Marcuse would have liked, but just I just wanted to start out with a little bit of a laugh because I thought that was hilarious. But one of the one thing that sticks out about Marcuse, unless anyone else has anything else to add about him, because just reading him for the most part just makes me go goggly-eyed because he's so obtuse. But the one interesting thing that I think Adam mentioned it last week, this one idea he had about changing people at the level of their biology, because the revolution isn't working. So how do we get the revolution to come about? Well, we have to change people on an instinctual level. He says, inasmuch as these needs and satisfactions of people, so like human nature, reproduce a life in servitude, He's saying that just the way people are tends, they tend to end up enjoying their consumerist servitude. Like, Luke gave that great example of his parents proselytizing to working class people that were happy, with what they had. So inasmuch as these things reproduce life of servitude, liberation presupposes changes in this biological dimension. That is to say, different instinctual needs, different reactions of the body as well as the mind. And he expands on this. So that was also in Essay on Liberation. And so he expands on that earlier in the same essay, where he kind of describes, this is what's so annoying about Marcuse. He tries to describe what he's talking about and essentially says, I'm not talking about what I'm talking about. So it makes everything kind of not make any sense. So he says, I use the terms biological and biology, not in the sense of the scientific discipline. So he's using the words in a sense in which they don't actually exist. Okay, so where is he going with this? But in order to designate the process and the dimension in which inclinations, behavior patterns, and aspirations become vital needs which, if not satisfied, would cause dysfunction of the organism. So he's kind of saying these things, I'm not saying these things are biological, but I'm calling them biological. But I think maybe some actual biologists would tend to agree that there are biological roots to inclinations, behavior patterns, and aspirations, but not entirely. And I think that's maybe what he's trying to get at, is that these things aren't entirely biological. It's not a total bottom-up process. And that's what he's banking on, is the fact that these can be changed. So he says, conversely, socially induced needs and aspirations may result in a more pleasurable organic behavior. If biological needs are defined as those which must be satisfied and for which no adequate substitute can be provided, certain cultural needs can sink down into the biology of man. We could then speak, for example, of the biological need for freedom, or of the aesthetic needs of having taken root in the organic structure of man, in his nature, or rather second nature. So,
you know what he's doing, Harrison?
He's just talking nonsense?
He's talking nonsense. He's adding a level of profundity to cultural programming. And it sounds to me like, particularly with the left, who have their own set of moral taste buds, to just radicalize and exacerbate whatever leanings individuals have in a certain sphere of political or social thinking, and just making it even more urgent, hystericized. But you like, I'm listening to you reading Marcuse right now, and it's just like Lindsay says, these academics spout this stuff, and it's designed by its very nature to sound highfalutin and well thought out and elevated. And in fact, it's
as John Leguizamo called it, thinky talk, highfalutin thinky talk.
Yeah. And once you realize that, and you get back, you pare it down. He's talking about programming. He's talking about brainwashing and hystericizing and pathologizing a certain segment of the population that is most vulnerable to the way he would like to see things go.
But I think he's actually, or Luke, did you have a response there before I go into that?
No, I was just reminded of something called behavioral design, which is something that is kind of a thing in design, and you actually want to shape people's behavior, by designing things a certain way. And nowadays it's often used, like to fight climate change or some stuff like that. Get people to be like CO2 neutral or whatever. So I was just reminded of that. When Marcuse says you got to change the needs, that something that people their drives basically. So you kind of manipulate them that they actually want to, I don't know, like save fuel or whatever. So I think you're spot on, Ilan. This is just what he's talking about is basically reprogramming people.
Mm-hmm. The way I see it is, well, I think I don't know enough about Marcuse if he actually had a disdain for science or just actual like clear thinking, because in here he's got so many kind of presuppositions that his argument, if you could call it that, is dependent on, that he doesn't get into. So he's talking about how these needs can sink down, but he doesn't give an actual example of how that actually takes place. He just kind of presupposes that it does take place and then builds this argument on top of it. But what he seems to just be saying is that, okay, so you can make people want a thing. I mean, that's part of his criticism of consumerism, I think, is that we're brainwashed to want things that we don't actually need, and then to be happy with those things and confirmed in our servitude. And that, so he's saying, well, that needs to become a deep-grained thing, like an instinctive need. So he says, well, I'm not saying that we need to change people's biology, but really, I think that's what he actually wants. I think that's what he actually needs, because what he's talking about and what he wants to happen, it wouldn't be enough to just change people on the level of like consumer goods or just these behavioral nudges that cognitive or behavioral psychologists are expert at manipulating. That's not. That wouldn't be enough. This gets into Lobachevsky and Ponerology, where one of Lobachevsky's most interesting points, I thought, was on the nature of pathocratic propaganda, is that they want and think it's possible to change human nature itself. And they're always disappointed with the results because it's impossible, because you're talking about a very stable like biological, psychological structure that can't be changed at the base level. And that's what you would actually need in order to have the vision, to implement the vision that guys like Marcuse and all the other totalitarians want. What they would need would be to go in at that biological level, at the most basic instinctual level, to change the actual instinctive substructure of humanity, and it won't work. So I thought that was just really interesting that Marcuse actually explicitly goes there. He's not just talking about the new socialist man. He's actually saying, oh, I'm not saying this, but I'm saying we need to change the actual biological instinctive nature of humanity in order to get the revolution to come through. So I thought that was interesting. But one other thing on that topic, Lindsay comments, he says, my reading of this riddle, biology that isn't really biological, is that Marcuse is calling for intentionally inducing psychopathologies as a form of liberatory consciousness. This is also something we mentioned last week, in the sense that being able to cope with day-to-day life as it is by definition a psychopathology. So he goes on to say that in this regard, Neo-Marxism seems to be a theory that is designed to cause those who accept it to develop or at least functionally mimic a paranoid personality disorder. And because that's essentially what Marcuse said in that first paragraph, is that, how did he put it? Vital needs which, if not satisfied, would cause dysfunction of the organism. So he wants to install new needs in people so that when those needs aren't met, they become dysfunctional. They become maladjusted to themselves and to society. So that's almost as explicit an endorsement of inducing psychopathology as you can get, is that we want to make people dysfunctional. We want to install a new need in them so that society doesn't give them what they need, and they form a break with society and want to tear it down. So he's basically saying we want to create antisocial people that will then allow us to tear down the system, which is quite interesting. And then he quotes some like Horkheimer. Horkheimer's vision, or this is, first it's Marcuse, his vision of the creation of a reality in accordance with the new sensitivity and the new consciousness. And then Horkheimer, critical theory maintains, it need not be so. Men can change reality, and the necessary conditions for such change already exist. So there's this deep-seated need in like all these brands of leftism to fundamentally alter reality, and from the psychopathological perspective, that may be because the individuals that think like this are fundamentally, in some way at odds with the existing social structure that a lot of people are just, relatively fine with. They may like see problems with it, but it's not such a deep-seated problem that, they want to destroy everything. There's an extremism, like this radicalism that goes along with it, that's just it seems kind of out of proportion to, well, in many regards. And well, that's at least how Lobachevsky would approach that.
Well, just as an example of something going like too far in terms of like a normal person looking at reality, right? Seeing some disparity, let's say, between the upper classes and the lower classes. Like, there's so much wealth within, say, the United States as an example, and yet there's still all of these people who are homeless. Okay, so that's for the average person. That's not good, but that's kind of as far as it goes. It's not, well, then we have to tear down everything. We have to burn it all to the ground. Yeah. It's not that deep. It's not that deep.
Yeah. I mean, I think
there's a hatred. Yeah.
Yeah. It can go a bit further than just, oh, well, that's not good, in the sense of, well, let's try to do something about this. And let's try to, maybe homeless shelters, maybe there are other like interventions we can make, things that we can do to fix this problem, as opposed to, we just need to tear it all down. We need to make everyone homeless first and then rebuild from the ground up. We just need to start at zero. And so, yeah, there's quite a gulf between those two approaches, between the evolutionary approach and the revolutionary approach. But of course, there are people as well who just don't want to do anything. They just don't care.
Then there was the.
I think that there.
Oh, well, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, I'll jump in then. So one thing that I'm going to backtrack a bit about, just Marcuse in particular, his stories, his narratives, the way that he's describing what he's seeing, or at least like ostensibly what he says he's doing is trying to explain what's going on, comes across as being one of those counter narratives, one of the counter storytelling methods by which the critical race theorists use to manipulate people into getting the things that they want. It has a very similar, shallow, paranoid, totally convoluted, and just wackadoodle reading of how things work and how things should change in order to make whatever he's talking about better, which he doesn't even really say. So it has that very same reality is irrelevant. It's about my narrative and how I feel. And because I feel this way and I can reason along this path that this is why it is this way, well then, I'm totally justified in saying all of the other things that I'm saying that need to be done to rectify it. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like you were saying, it's a total being at total odds with reality. And if you're at total odds with reality, then you can't use reality as a means by which that to measure any kind of changes or to structure any kind of changes. It can't map to reality. So the only thing you can do is come up with a counter narrative, implausible or as irrelevant as it might seem. That's kind of all you have. And so it makes sense that that's where he goes.
Well, the interesting part about that is how upfront these folks are about the idea that there is no truth or that there is no objective reality, or in any case, we shouldn't even attempt to ascertain what it is, because in their thinking, my lived truth as a minority, as a gender, as a person of a specific sexual orientation is the truth, and everything needs to be defined and seen within that particular identity as the truth. That's what's, I think, speaks so much to this idea of superficiality of the whole thing. So one point he makes is well, he gets a little bit into intersectionality. This is Lindsay, and he points to a figure in the progression of thinking along these lines named Kimberly Crenshaw, who's like a UCLA professor who's been talking about this forever. And what she'll say is, she'll present herself as a Black person, as opposed to a person who happens to be Black. And she's upfront with the idea that it's more powerful to present as the identity, as opposed to a part of a universal part of humanity, a person who happens to be this, that, or the other thing. And what that forces another person to do is to see them through their victimhood, that the individual is trying to impose or convey upon the other in order to accrue power. So Lindsay makes the point in one of his talks, actually, that it's what's so limiting about it is that it takes away from any of the common sense or reasonableness or universality or plurality or level of teamwork, as opposed to working within a kind of hive mind that these people would seek to impose on society. And I think that's one way that they convince themselves and convince others who are vulnerable to enforce their particular victimhood and minority status on others.
Yeah, I mean, about the unhingedness from reality that you all spoke about, I think it's a very good point. And if you look at this thing that you mentioned, Ilan, with a Black person as opposed to a person who happens to be Black, I mean, there's just a total unhingedness or disconnect from reality. I mean, these people, they basically argue that like race is a social construct, right? So it doesn't really exist. But since they do want to do something, right? They have an agenda, so they reinterpret this that it is like a social construct that is like generated by the white power, but it's actually good, if we think in this kind of in these terms, because it's a lived experience or something along these lines, and it's just so bizarre, this argument. It comes down to just making shit up as you go along, basically, right? I mean, and that's kind of a theme that seems to run through a lot of these kinds of thinkers. I mean, the Frankfurt School, for example, they always insisted that science and theory, like scientific theory, should have a strong ethical component. It should be somehow like intertwined with an agenda, following Marx, of course, who said, philosophers have always just tried to understand the world, but we need to change it. But this gives like a total carte blanche or free pass to make things up, because you can't just make such claims and then not justify them, right? I mean, they never developed a theory that as to what ethics should be, or like why they should be justified, or like the relationship between ethics and truth, and and all those questions. It's just sort of a sleight of hand to make things up, basically, and that's something that I think really runs is kind of a current, whether you look at Marcuse or like the earlier Frankfurt School guys, and later all those black theories and theorists and all of that. And that's just something that really springs to mind for me, or that stands out, that this ungroundedness of the whole enterprise. I mean, you don't necessarily have to ground everything in strict facts. I think that's, that would be like a bit simplistic as well, but you need to ground it in something, right? And through, I think they're kind of playing a game of coming up with this rather convoluted language and arguments that hide the fact that they basically give themselves permission to make things up. And there's also a kind of hatred, between the lines that I find interesting, and that is along similar lines, Harrison, as you said, with the idea of basically turning everyone into pathology, or infecting everyone with like a pathology or something like that. It's like again this hatred of the normal people, whether it's like the blue collar, like real working class, who want to have a family and a house and a car or whatever, and you can feel that the disdain and therefore the need to reprogram them or like change their drives. There's like a hatred of the basic drives of humanity, of normal human nature, basically. So I think that's really something that is kind of dangerous, and is a strong current through many of these theories, at least after the war.
Mm-hmm. What a couple of you have said brings us to these deep ideological roots, because we've been describing the dialectical faith and the progression of the dialectic. Like Kimberly Crenshaw, as Lindsay interprets, is that she took the thesis and the antithesis of like Neo-Marxism and postmodernism, because there was this conflict, there was this contradiction where first of all, with the problem with Neo-Marxism was that these were a bunch of white guys that didn't understand the centrality of race, for instance. And the problem with the postmodernists is that they could decontextualize and deconstruct race as just another social contract. I'm getting into Rousseau, social construct, and so the way to synthesize that was to say, well, no, like the postmodernists might deconstruct race, but because it is part of this systemic power from critical theory that is imposed on people, it can't be deconstructed because it's made real. And because it's made real, we can't escape it. So it doesn't pay, and it doesn't make it doesn't pay to deconstruct. It can't be deconstructed because it becomes part, like almost like Marcuse's biology. It becomes that instinctual thing. It becomes essentialized almost. But even though they're anti-essentialist, there are no essential racial properties. So the synthesis was then intersectionality, where intersectionality can take into account of all these things, where on the intersection between race and feminism, for instance, you can find all of those like intersectional anomalies that were still left out of like the civil rights movement, or just that there was progress here and progress there, but in the middle there was something where it wasn't there yet. And intersectionality manages to capture all of this in this fusion of Neo-Marxism and postmodernism. And so Lindsay sees that as this dialectical progression, and then traces this back and says, okay, so the postmodernists were post-Marxists, the critical theorists were neo-Marxists, and each of these philosophical or movements, what they did was they adopted the dialectical method of looking at their past, looking at their progenitors, at these philosophies, looking at the contradictions between them, and then synthesizing something new out of them by picking and choosing the things that worked, and then leaving out the things that didn't work to come up with this new synthesis that in their minds would work. And of course, each one's just another shit show, but that's kind of the way it has worked. And so that's what even Marx was doing. Well, so the critical theorists did the same thing with Marx and said, okay, well, here's Marx. Marx had these great ideas, but here are the contradictions because what he proposed isn't working. The class conflict isn't progressing as he thought it would. So we have to leave that behind, and we have to come up with a new synthesis that centers culture, or like for the cultural Marxists, or what's a one-word description of what the critical theorists centered on or fixed? Well, this was it maybe. Well, this isn't the best description, but like the consumerist aspect of it is this. It also cultural. I mean, there's this. The thing to look at are these cultural elements that we have to focus on.
False consciousness. Maybe?
Well, false consciousness is one. There was, I think, if you want to kind of like boil it down into like a simple progression of how it all kind of worked, I think you would do kind of what Lindsay did, which is starting from the first and working backwards. Mm-hmm. So you have the critical race theorists, who were a synthesis of the opposition between cultural Marxism and Maoist China, as an example, where Mao, knowingly or not, kind of took on a lot of the cultural Marxist style party points, where if you deconstruct the culture and reshape it, well, then you'll have the Marxist utopia. That's kind of like the basic idea. And so when you see how that didn't work out, and you see the theory that supposedly was supposed to make it work, that's where they were like, something else must be going on. Oh, that's where race comes in, because that's actually the center point. And then working backwards from there, the cultural Marxists were the synthesis of actual Marx and then the Bolshevik Revolution, where, the thesis was Marxist theory. The Bolsheviks were the antithesis, where a lot of people died and it didn't work out as they thought it would. And so, what must be going on is the culture. We need to change the culture. So that's kind of how I see the way things progressed, is along these dialectical lines, because of how they see things, or how they see history as having to move along dialectical lines.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts, Luke?
Yeah, about the whole dialectic thing. I mean, that's an interesting topic. I think, it comes back to this unhingedness, right? I mean, if you define the dialectic, in that way, right, you can basically, again, you can make shit up. I mean, it's, if you create endless synthesis, but there's no criterion, like which thing is, synthesized with what, and what is actually like the synthesis, right? I mean, you can just deploy that kind of thing and just come up with almost everything, right? But the root is, of course, like this whole Hegel thing, and the idea that basically that there is in the history, or in the development of history, there are these contradictions that emerge, right, and that need to be resolved, and something comes out of them. And Hegel developed his whole philosophy, or parts of it, around that idea, and it was actually super influential, right? I mean, it's not just the leftists who invoke Hegel. He has been invoked by almost everybody. It's it's kind of interesting. And Collingwood, for example, was very much influenced by Hegel as well. I mean, the whole his whole idea of this progression from art to religion to philosophy and science. This comes straight from Hegel. I mean, that's basically exactly what he said. Although Collingwood has his own twist, and it's quite different, But the principle it's there in Hegel. But I just wanted to say something about that, because Hegel, Lindsay kind of to tell his story, basically puts Hegel into this whole line of villains, right? And maybe the uber villain because he started the whole thing. But I don't think it's that simple. I mean, I just wanted to read a quote from Hegel that I found pretty funny in that context. He says, property is not merely a means of satisfying needs, but an end in itself, since it is a form of freedom. So take that, Marxists. And here, but that's pretty funny. But the more important thing is that Hegel was kind of like it is like a whole almost esoteric, spiritual, mystical kind of teaching, right? I mean, it's. It reminds me in some ways even of Whitehead, and there are other people who saw like similarities in both Whitehead's philosophy and Hegel's actually. It's like this weird mixture between like a very systematic approach, but then it's like almost mystical, in nature. And just to give you a taste, because people always talk about, like how Marx, basically took over from Hegel, but it's just there's this property quote, but it's just a very different thing, right? I mean, because Marx saw the creation, like consciousness being basically like determined by society and social forces and economic forces. That's what he called materialism. Which is like a pretty crazy idea. I mean, it's like the social determinism kind of thing, or social constructivism. And for Hegel, that was not true at all. I mean, he thought, there's everything. He was an idealist, so everything comes from the mind, and mind is prior. But about his idea, that history progresses along certain lines and a certain dialectic, so to say. It has been criticized, and rightfully so, because it's very teleological. And I'm not a Hegel expert to judge whether I don't know how much of it was determined in his mind, or whether this all was a done deal. But it's still very different, from any kind of Marxist or utopian thinking. So I just want to read a quote, which is actually a Diepel translation, so it's probably the worst Hegel translation ever made. But I read it anyway. This glorification of the truth is to be grasped as the absolute final purpose, and this truth is the only power which accomplishes this glorification. In the glory of God, also the individual spirit has its glory, but not its special one, but its glory is through the knowledge that its self-sense is the substantial consciousness of God, that its doing is for the glory of God, the Absolute. In this, the individual spirit has attained its truth and freedom, is dealing with the pure concept, with the absolute, is with no other but with itself, with its essence, not with the accidental, but in absolute freedom. This, then, would be the final purpose of world history. In this idea, the opposition has fallen away, which is in the limited spirit, which considers its being only in a barrier and rises above it by thought. So the idea is basically that Hegel says that at some point in history, in every nation, so he always thought about nations, right? He was no internationalist in that sense. He thought about the spirits of nations and the development of nations. So that at some point, what happens is that there after like a very like fruitful period, there comes kind of like a stasis where it's like a very rigid morality and religion, and the nation becomes stale. And at this point, there's the world of thought, of science and philosophy, and deep thinking kind of arises and questions these traditional virtues and morals and religion and all of that. So that reminds one definitely a bit of Collingwood and what he thought about that. And so then, but he says which is also very interesting, that this kind of movement also contains a certain destruction, self-destruction. So that's almost a bit prophetic, right? This idea that, once you transcend, you start thinking about all of that and criticizing it, then there's a certain danger that the whole thing goes downhill. But he also thinks that if that happens, there's basically an opportunity to develop along those spiritual lines, let's say, towards like some sort of unification with God, and that history kind of progresses in that way if we're lucky, so that there's that kind of like everyone is like has a true understanding of God, and is this is the final glorification of God. So it's kind of like a spiritual religious vision. So it really has very, very little, if anything, to do with any Marxist idea of class struggle and the dialectic playing out between classes and then generating the communist utopia. So we got to really see, I think, that as much as you might criticize Hegel, and he has been rightfully criticized for a lot of things, but it definitely is like a whole different story than Marxism. And I think this idea of dialectic, it has some really interesting components. And maybe as a final point, I think the difficulty here is that there's this kind of divide between, like the science guys, let's say, and the left, or to put it that way, and there's a certain danger on the part of the science guys, who tend to dismiss like Hegel and all kinds of other thinkers who are more of like a certain mystical bent and are maybe a bit obscure about that. But the thing is, we kind of need to grapple with the idea that that it's not like just science or like some like Enlightenment values, whatever that is, or rationality. It's not enough, right? I mean, there is something to be said about how to ground truth and what kind of if there is some kind of relativism to it all, as we saw with Collingwood and his absolute presuppositions that can neither be proven nor like disproven. And I think these are deep questions that we kind of cannot evade and just point to science, and say, okay, science says this, and so therefore the lefties are wrong, right? I mean, it's just not that simple, and that's also part of the appeal that some thinkers on the left have had, and I think Jordan Peterson also said that the postmodernists, they have a point in certain ways, and these deep questions, they don't go away. So I think it's kind of dangerous to. Not that Lindsay necessarily does it, I think he's actually quite smart about like the whole question of religion and all of that. But in the book, he basically bashes Hegel, as the ur daddy of this whole, theory nonsense, and I think that's maybe a bit simplistic, or as I think I'll leave it at that. But maybe you guys have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'm going to read one page of what Lindsay says about Hegel, but before that, I was reminded of something that Lobachevsky wrote in Ponerology about communism, basically, about ideologies in general as they relate to totalitarianism. And he said something like, I'm just going to very loosely paraphrase it, something like, the fact that any of these ideologies are so effective and can get enough support to actually fulfill a revolution suggests that there's actually something within that ideology that's true, that has some relation to truth. It might be like it might be what's the word? Like a substitute, or it might be a poor substitute, but there's something in there. There's a kernel in there to use the alchemical language that Lindsay also doesn't like. There's something in there that actually makes it resonant with a bunch of people that is more than just just brainwashing. So with that in mind, I thought there were two interesting. There was this one page on Hegel, and then there's this one page on Marx that I'll read later. That I read in this context, because when it comes to Hegel, it seems that, like for me, when I'm reading the description of Hegel and like the really like bird's eye view of Hegel, I'm like, okay, well that actually makes sense. Oh, there's a little thing where I think things went wrong, or here he's emphasizing this too much. But even the whole idea of the dialectic, like Lindsay points out, I mean, the dialectical methods have been around since Plato, since the origins of Western philosophy, and it's such a basic thing, such a basic concept that, I mean, Hegel may be the first to have really kind of drilled down and simplified it and made it obvious. But I mean, like you read McGilchrist several times talks about like certain dialectic phenomena. And if you look at paradigm shifts like Kuhn's paradigm shifts, the theory of scientific revolutions, it's essentially a dialectical process where you have a paradigm, you encounter anomalous data, which there's a contradiction between the theory and reality, the empirical data, and then there arises a new paradigm, which is a synthesis of the old paradigm and the new data that encompasses all of the data that the first paradigm encompassed, plus the additional new data that wasn't encompassed by the first paradigm. And so you have this new synthesis, this new paradigm, and I think it's just a description of how reality works, how ideas work, how everything is a building on and a rejection of what came before. That's just the way things work. And Hegel just described it with some peculiarities, like just some of the things that he got wrong or emphasized weirdly. So with that said, here's the page from Race Marxism. So Lindsay writes, Hegel's peculiar dialectical metaphysics has to bear on this discussion at this point to make any sense of this so-called science. So he's talking about Hegel's idea of science and how it wasn't, it's not what we tend to think of as science today. Of course, this was before science as we know it today. So in broad sweeping strokes, Hegel believed that the idea, or the absolute, is the true nature of the deity. Being generally hermetic, alchemical, in his orientation in the dialectical way, however, Hegel would have believed that the deity cannot know itself without comparing itself against an abject other, being compared against nothing, synthesized in becoming. That's very Whiteheadian right there. Or the idea, sublime, compared against nature, mundane, synthesized in Geist, or spirit, phenomenal. To keep it brief, Hegel saw this trinity not as an atemporal, eternal Godhead, like in the Christian metaphysics he speculated upon, but as a process corkscrewing through time, history. So again, a process corkscrewing through time, that's also very Whiteheadian, or McGilchristian. The idea begets nature. The nature, through the state, begets the spirit. At the largest scale, the world spirit, the Weltgeist. The Weltgeist moves people to act, change their circumstances, and think in new ways, thus generating a new idea. With each turn of the corkscrew, more contradictions work themselves out, and all three parts, idea, state, and Geist, are aufgehoben, abolished as they were and lifted up to a higher level. The process repeats until the last contradiction of all, the idea that is perfected, but doesn't yet know that it is perfected, after which the process, which is history, ends. In other words, Hegel's metaphysics would see the divine bringing the created world, nature, into being so that it can come to know itself as deity. How? Even though this is a hermetic construct, here we should note Marx's invocation of the Gnostic concept of the demiurgos as intermediary creator being identified with thinking. This relates, sorry if that's obscure, but it relates to a previous paragraph. Thus, for Hegel, the absolute attaining self-knowledge would be produced by the life process, thought, of the created human beings, which he envisioned taking its highest form in the dialectic. Thus, Hegel's is a dialectical faith by which God creates an abject other, the world, including man, so that he can understand himself, and then only realizes himself to be God after human beings think through and synthesize, or more accurately, concretize, all the contradictions that exist in their understanding of the world. Progressing the dialectic therefore becomes the imperative of the Hegelian faith. Taking steps to accelerate this process is now referred to as being on the right side of history, while hindering it, by seeking to maintain the status quo, for example, is being on the wrong side of history. So we see how theory, capital T, of all stripes generates religious duties of conscience in activism for their adherents. So here, Lindsay at various times, well, on the next page, will point to kind of a few of the things in there that he points out as, or that he identifies as being like kind of the errors in there. Well, he probably sees them all as errors, but the big ones being like the focus on the state. So the state is the means by which that idea is generated. And I think that's probably, I think Hegel got that wrong. It's not, the state isn't the perfect representation of how the idea takes form in a society, or in the world. I think that's more of just a product of the time he lived in. And then also, and then also this idea that he hints at in these last few sentences that I don't know for sure if Hegel actually saw it this way or not, but there's this whole idea, and maybe he did, this whole idea of of history being this this freight train, and it just rolls over people, and it's just too bad for you. That's just history. That's just the dialectic. That's just the inevitable contradictions that will result in like destruction and mayhem or people dying or torture or whatever. That's just how history progresses. So once we get to the end of history, that it'll all be worth it because, well, you were just the eggs that we had to break to make the omelet of the absolute finally realized. And he calls that the kind of dialectical theodicy, the justification for evil in the world. Luke, did you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, there was in the passage you read, I think actually it sounds like a pretty good, I would say like summary of some of Hegel's thought, that Lindsay brought forth. But there was one, I think, sleight of hand, towards the end, where he basically jumps from Hegel directly to like the Marxist and Neo-Marxist ideas, right? Where it's like you're too bad if you're on the wrong side of history, and we need to accelerate, the dialectic. I'm by no means a Hegel expert, but I don't think that's really was the idea, and it's a bit like. As you said, like the justification for evil thing. You can see it that way, but I think it's a bit cynical actually to look at it that way because it's a bit like Collingwood with his idea that there's certain phases in history and that develop. You probably don't need to say so that's all deterministic and just too bad you can't do anything and we should accept all the evil that brings with. It's that we're on a more religious or spiritual plane almost where that's something that in Christian thought as well people have grappled with, right? The idea that is it all worth it, all the suffering at the end of the day, is there some system to the madness, is there some purpose that in the final stages of how this whole unfolds, is there something there that makes it worth it, that we may have learned something or that we need to go through this development to glorify God as Hegel had it. These are like deep religious questions and definitely, the Marxists and all that. That's really cynical, and so he's right in that way. But I wouldn't say, that it's I wouldn't put it like he put it at the end of the paragraph you read it, maybe to say, oh, it's just a justification. It's this mechanical view of history, and it's just a justification of all the suffering. Although again, Hegel has been criticized and rightfully so for a bit too strong a teleology and too strong a like an idea that history just unfolds according to plan, basically. So that's a valid criticism, I guess.
Well, I'm not well steeped in Hegel either, but what this does remind me of a little bit, and it's been a long time since I've read any Nietzsche, but it's just like how any philosopher that is well known and has some following has been appropriated by an ideology or a government to help support its own movement. So the Nazi Party touted Nietzsche and interpreted things in a certain way, and yet there are others who would find great wisdom and insight into Nietzsche's works that had nothing whatsoever to do with Nazism or interpreting the Übermensch as some kind of Aryan knight, Nazi style. So perhaps Lindsay is, he's reacting to the way that not so much to Hegel as to the way that Hegel may be misappropriated or interpreted or twisted to serve the ideology that he's pointing out.
Well, so after Hegel came Marx, of course. So along the lines of how we were approaching Hegel, now let's look at Marx. Again, I'll read just one little excerpt from what Lindsay says about Marx. He says, in fact, Marxism is the second, following Hegel's philosophy from which it is derived, in a long line of modern-era Gnostic cult ideologies that seek to characterize God as tyrannical and the existing order of the world as a prison, hello Foucault, into which we are flung, hello Heidegger, that we can escape if we discover the true nature of reality, which is a kind of consciousness that must be raised. That is, Marxism is rebellious Gnosticism reconfigured for industrial modernity. This is the basis of Marx's desire to center man in himself, which he posited is a necessary precondition to man's true independence. This is the same false promise made by the serpent in Genesis, by the way. Being scientistic and capitalizing upon the advent of scientific authority through the 19th century, Marxism focuses on providing a scientific study of history, a modern-era demiurge, which it treats as a kind of deity for a new industrial age. In recognizing that economic exploitation was the most fruitful vein of agitation to achieve a Gnostic revolution, Marxism utilizes economic and material conditions as the fodder for generating the necessary conflict to enact a mass rebellion against God and reality. Critical race theory is hardly different, except that it makes race the central construct for understanding inequality instead of class, and seeks to awaken an agitated racial consciousness instead of an alienated class consciousness. So, well, I'm going to have a bunch to say about Gnosticism, but coming back to this idea about, what communism, like what Marxism provided for, the people, or provides still for the people that support it, what is it there that latches on? I don't think it's entirely some pathological thing. It's not, of course, the pathology has a lot to do with it, but there's something more to it. And I think it's that teleological sense of it's this utopian vision. And I'd go further than Lindsay to say it's not just Marxist, or it's not just a Gnostic. It's actually just fundamentally religious, and even specifically Christian in its in its vision, the idea that there is a coming kingdom, that there's something else, in the future. There's some vague possibility, like the critical theorists were searching at. Of course, they were looking at it strictly in terms of this materialist Marxist conception of a world without exploitations, in terms of production and just these kind of economic ideas. But on the religious plane, there's this idea that there is another world, right? That there's a fundamental transformation or shift in the individual and in the world. There is the world itself is transforming. You can find this in Paul's letters, that there's some goal, there's some teleology, not in the sense of a strict like paint by the numbers, this is the way history is progressing, but there's an ideal, there's a goal that can be worked towards that exists in some sense and can be approached and achieved. And I think that's what these ideologies in their dialectic tend to evoke in people, that there is something more, and it's like a substitute for religion, which had provided that almost exclusively for thousands of years before then. And so I think that's kind of what's going on there. That why people can can find meaning in these ideologies is they're cheap substitutes, essentially. But they're still, at least they're still providing that in as cheap a substitute as they are. It's still providing it, and then people kind of latch onto that, or some people at least. And so but I want to comment on Lindsay's use of the word Gnostic, because he's cited, and he's cited this guy a lot, Eric Vogelin. And the work he cites is Science, Politics, and Gnosticism, 2 essays. And just to get into that, I think Lindsay's wrong here, but I think he's wrong because Vogelin was wrong. So I want to get a bit into this book, New Inquisitions by Arthur Versluis, who we've interviewed. And he's got a chapter on Vogelin, because unlike Vogelin, Versluis is an expert in Gnosticism. So he kind of knows what he's talking about. So I want to read a bit here, and then we'll get back to Marx and Hegel and Lindsay, and how they may or may not be Gnostic in nature. So Versluis writes, first, what is gnosis anyway? Vogelin writes that it is knowledge, implying that it is just another form of ordinary knowledge or information. But in fact, the word gnosis, in its generally accepted scholarly sense, refers to knowledge of God, or to put it another way, transcendence of the subject-object division. The word knowledge entails a subject knowing an object, but gnosis may perhaps better be termed the realization of inner union between the individual consciousness and divine revelation. The word revelation implies a revealer, and in the various Gnostic writings one finds numerous instances of the divine revealer, in general, Christ. Gnosticism generally cannot be described as self-salvation, though throughout the Gnostic writings, one finds the theme of divine revelation and the need for both human effort toward realizing gnosis, as well as the need for corresponding divine grace or angelic help. But most interesting of all is Vogelin's claim that the Gnostic seeks destruction of the old world, and even more startlingly, world destruction, and that such Gnostic attempts are a futile effort to disturb the order of being and the order of society. This is interesting perhaps most of all because there is no evidence for the idea that Gnostics, as represented in the actual writings we possess, were engaged in any such effort at world destruction at all. It is arguable that Gnosticism, as part of the larger emergence of Christianity in late antiquity, represented a shift from Platonism or Hermetism in the Gnostics in the Nag Hammadi library writings, in that Gnostics in the Nag Hammadi library writings often insisted on the decisive revelatory power of Christ, separating them to some extent from the other religious traditions of the era. But in fact, Platonism and Hermetism are directly represented in the Nag Hammadi collection, and when one looks closely at the actual collection, one finds nowhere in it an urge toward world destruction, or even the deliberate disruption of social order. Rather, one finds an insistent an insistence on direct inner spiritual experience as opposed to, say, worldly or social power. One finds numerous instances of visionary revelations and some ethical admonitions, as well as what we may call mystery sayings, like those of Christ in the Gospel of Thomas. So I'll read a few other just short, like sentence-long ones, but basically Vogelin was a staunch Catholic and had this idea of Gnosticism that didn't actually exist, and to the extent that it did, probably came from like Tertullian and Irenaeus in the 300s and their anti-heresiological writings, which presented their vision of what the Gnostics represented, which actually didn't correspond to reality. And we learned this once we actually found, their writings. So the second main point he makes is this idea of this historical eschatology. And so at a couple points in this chapter, Lindsay talks about this historical eschatology that's in Marxism, and which I alluded to with that vision of the other world, of the future world, that this is an eschatological faith that this new world will come into being, this parody of the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God. And so Vogelin characterizes, he makes the distinction between essential Christianity on the one hand and the, quote, the gnosis of historical eschatology on the other. The only problem that Versluis points out is that there's no eschatology in the Gnostics. The eschatology is actually mainstream Christianity. That's where you find eschatology. Eschatology is the mainstream Christian view of how the world progresses. Millennialism is orthodox. So he says, thus it turns out, is a quite interesting confusion, not least because Gnosticism, using the broadest meaning of the term, the perspectives of those who seek or espouse gnosis, is precisely opposed to an historicist view of Christianity. So he says, where do we in fact find the origins of this Christian tradition of historical eschatology? The answer is certainly not in Gnosticism. It is rather within Catholicism. He goes on, but one could just as well argue that this millennialist tendency is precisely a result of the loss of gnosis as a possibility within Catholicism. And he gives a bit about the history of the Catholic mystical tradition and how Catholics, there is a tiny and very small mystical tradition in Catholicism, much more so in Eastern Orthodoxy. But in the Catholic tradition, there were two big Catholic mystics, like Dionysius the Areopagite, and one other. And then in Protestantism, there's Jacob Boehme. We talked about them with Versluis when we talked with him. So Saint Clement of Alexandria, he's the other Catholic. So there's this. It's just funny that the Gnostics actually represented all of the. They weren't about worldly power. They're more like the Christian Taoists or Zen meditators or something. Like these are people focused on more of an inner spiritual revelation to become more spiritual beings. They're not concerned with social revolution or establishing worldly power. So the only sense in which you could call Marx or Marxist Gnostics is as or Gnostics is as the anti-Gnostics. They're the ones that are this bizarro upside down version of what the Gnostics actually represented. And then, as Versluis points out, if you look at the history of totalitarianism and its progenitor in in the Inquisitions, it's the Gnostics who were the first ones to the chopping block in all these totalitarian systems. So the Gnostics aren't the ones that were responsible for totalitarianism in any cases. They were the ones that were persecuted by the totalitarians. So let me just see if there was anything else. So yeah, he basically says they represent the dissident element within Christianity. And was there anything else? So this opposition is what the whole of Vogelin's work disguises by confusing Gnosticism with historicist millennialism. So I'll leave that there and then just come back to this quote. So it's a long Marxism is the second in a long line of modern era Gnostic cult ideologies that seek to characterize God as tyrannical and the existing order of the world as a prison. So this is another one of those ideas. So this is kind of like this matrix idea that the world is a prison. Well, you can easily have like pathological versions of that, like, Marcuse seeing the entire world as this prison. But in the mystical tradition and in the kind of contemplative tradition, there's a relativizing that goes on where, in comparison to the real world as it actually, or in comparison to the monastic life or the spiritual life, the contemplative life, then ordinary life does relativize out to being like a prison. There's this higher spiritual dimension where, like, well, I don't know how far I want to get into that, but you can see it's not so black and white that every worldview or ideology or religion or religious worldview that sees the world as a prison is necessarily like this resentful, rebellious teenager, like rebellious Gnostics, just harping on the world and saying how horrible it is. Like, I think that's a caricaturization of what the actual Gnostics and mystics, throughout history have actually represented. In fact, they were often like Jacob Boehme, often like the pillars of the community, in the sense that, like, a lot of the existing pastors and priests weren't. Like, and you can see the same thing going on in Russia in the various, like, Orthodox heresies that cropped up in Russia, where they were criticizing the rampant corruption in the Russian Orthodox Church, and you have all these like hermit groups and ideologies or religious ideologies that crop up because of the corruption within the church, and then it's the church that crushes the rebellious Gnostics, who weren't totalitarians. They were just and they weren't like, yeah. I just think it's a misrepresentation of what was actually going on. So he has a few things like that, and I think it's just unfortunate, just because and I blame Vogelin. So just like Lindsay blames Hegel, I'm going to blame Vogelin for at least this aspect. But any comments on that? Any comments on Marx or any of the things I brought up? Or
I think the Gnostic idea is I think actually, the real Gnosticism that you just outlined, Harrison, and there's actually some of that in Hegel as well. Mm-hmm. And when I just it's pretty obvious, right? But I just want to read one quote. For example, he rejected the soul, what he calls soul body duality. So he sees it as a unity, and he puts it actually, like, it's kind of beautifully, I think. He says that the soul or the mind world, it's like a spiritual tone poured out over the whole, which directly reveals the body as an externality of a higher nature. So that's kind of like some connections there. And I think you're right. I mean, it doesn't follow that you see certain things in the world that you necessarily want to crush the world, right? Or just to radically change it. I think that's really something that came with Marx and this idea. I mean, Hegel he said, like, the only purpose of philosophy is like to show that the reasonableness of religion, right? So it's basically a theology, and Marx, of course, like put man on the pedestal and killed everything religious and put it out of the equation, and that's how you end up, I think, with this drive to, like, radically change everything, right? I mean, if it's just man, and if it's not embedded in some higher reality or some teleological thinking or some vision, religious vision for the future, or for possible redemption and all of that, then what you end up with is, the only choice is, to take matters in your own hand, right? There's just it's just logical, that you'll become a revolutionary, and I think that's really part of the malaise of the whole Marxist enterprise, and it's basically a religion that categorically denies it is a religion and argues, against religion, but then all you have is earthy revolution, and we know how that ends, and I think one thing that you mentioned as well is about the appeal that Marxism has, and the, let's say, the positive aspects of it, and I think there's something to be said about that too, because how you say it, it's who isn't alienated to some extent, from the modern world? It's just who hasn't a vision, or let's say a longing for a different world, where things are not only better but more in balance and more true to human nature, actually, and I think that's how many people understand these kinds of ideas, the more benign Marxists, or those in the tradition of that kind of thinking, they, as Lobachevsky said, there's a tendency to filter out the bad stuff and kind of project your own rich inner vision, on such theories, but there's just something there, right? And I think it's pretty understandable given the state of the world, and all the problems and the craziness of modern life and the nihilism and everything, to have that kind of longing. And there have been Marxists, it must be said, or people who call themselves Marxists, who actually were pretty smart people and contributed a lot of positive things. I'm just thinking of Michael Parenti, for example, who wrote this book about Caesar, and he calls himself a Marxist, and his son, I forgot his name, he's around, and he's just listened to a podcast with him and Max Blumenthal, and they are also left wingers and possibly Marxists. I don't know if they call themselves Marxists, but wouldn't be surprised. And these are really interesting people, and who have lots of interesting things to say, and so we shouldn't forget that. And I have even seen that sometimes in the critical race theory people, right? I think Lindsay says that they're all basically a bunch of liars, and they hide their true intentions, and I think that's definitely true to some extent, and especially those academics who come up with these crazy theories. I'm not sure they're up to any good, and also there's this tendency to just hide the true extent of the radicalness of these ideas. But then again, there might also be many people who might consider themselves critical race theory sympathizers or whatever, and they might actually have some good points and don't just and truly they're not lying, about them being just concerned about racial issues traditionally understood. They actually might believe that, right? And they just kind of either filter out the more radical elements of the theories, or don't even know about them sometimes. So yeah, and also again, there is this impulse, which is not unhealthy, to just basically long for a better world, right? Where even these kinds of race issues are not so prevalent, and so I think that's something to consider as well. And the one thing is to fight the bad stuff, and I think it's really necessary. I'm not so close to the problem because it's more of a US thing than a European thing, but still I totally get the need to stand up to that, and the danger in these crazy ideologies. But on the other hand, I think there should also be room for dialogue, if possible, and basically, connect to, or like connect via our common humanity and our like common longing for a better world, to the degree we have it. I mean, some people just don't have it, I guess, but those who have it, there's common ground right there, and maybe even we can get to a point where we reconnect with the real religious impulse that is behind all of that, and the real theological ideas. Like some of the Gnosticism things, why not, right? And some of the more like theistic kind of approaches. It doesn't have to be like crazy religion style, and it doesn't have to be like opium for the masses style. So maybe we once again, or that's my hope at least, will find some common ground there.
And on the subject of religion, Luke, there were a couple of things you mentioned that reminded me of Lindsay's concerted efforts to work with the Southern Baptist Convention, I think it was, and some other religious groups to point out to them very specifically how it is that CRT, critical race theory, is being weaponized, and how it's being used to play upon the thinking and the intentions and the very services that some of these organizations are out there to provide, which is a traditional religious kind of service and understanding of the world, and so that speaks very much to Lindsay's understanding, I think, of how you not only have these ideas that have been progressing as a response to or a reaction to certain prior modes of thinking and philosophy, but you also have this kind of Saul Alinsky style, playbook where the academics and the thinkers and the think tankers and the politicians and perhaps even some other more nefarious groups have been actively thinking about the rhetoric and the modes by which they can implement these policies for public schools, for corporations and their hiring methods, for other public organizations. And it's so aggressive where, he describes how the proponents of CRT in various organizations are very, conniving and manipulative about passing the way that they pass their company rules or the legislation through, by attaching it to other things, by making it the last item on the docket that can't be discussed thoroughly or thought about, by the means by which the verbal tools of attack, the rhetoric that is employed to shut down people who oppose dissenting perspectives on all this. It's a very concerted effort. These aren't merely ideas that are being held to, or free to discuss, or free to teach, but rather in their kernel and he points out that it's even been self-described by some of these academics as a cancer, that this will be a cancerous or viral idea that has to be, I don't think he uses the word inflicted, but he conveys that this is an infliction of ideas, that these folks who are ideologically possessed manage to push through in a very aggressive way. And we've seen this in the news in stories of groups of people who approach people in public and basically assault them for their white privilege, for instance, or demand that they kneel before, one or the other of them. But this sort of coercion, that's the word, exists at many different levels and in many different ways. They've really thought this through. And what Lindsay is saying is, we first have to understand all of this, why it is in these ideas that have progressed to the state that they currently are and that we see. But it's also time now to decide what our red lines are, what our limits are within each of us, and to, as constructively as possible. And he qualifies this by saying, don't be a reactionary. Don't sound like a bigoted, overwrought, crazy person. Don't use their tools. But certainly networking about this and challenging the prevailing policy at in whatever sphere, whether it's your child's school or the organization that you work for, whatever is possible, or just supporting someone who is coherently making a case and discussing Fourth Amendment rights of free speech as opposed to compelled speech. That it's time now for a constructive response, and I thought that's something that he does very well. That he says, okay, we have all of this information. We're seeing what's going on now. We understand basically why it is that it's being implemented. We also know from folks like Michael Rechtenwald, who we've had here, and I think Lindsay understands this a great deal himself, is that all of this on some level is also in service to, it's no coincidence that the World Economic Forum and Great Resetter elite are completely in line with a lot of these ideas. In fact, that they are, from their level of influence, a major proponent and propagating all of this nonsense. So that should be a question in people's minds. We see the academics and their spheres of influence. We know that California legislators have been putting through a lot of these ideas in practice, or trying to, until they get shut down or resisted. But then we have this even bigger global moneyed influence. So in any case, it's interesting to see how all of these things work at different levels of society, and yeah, his point about making this understanding as putting it into real life application as safely and as constructively and as judiciously as possible is kind of what we need to do now, to the extent that we can.
All right. Well, I don't think there's anything else to say after that. Ilan wrapped it all up for us, bringing it to the current events and how it all applies now, today. So with that said, yeah, that was our discussion. Second on race Marxism. I still haven't read the last couple chapters, so we may or may not come back for a third show on it. We'll see. But book's available on Amazon. We've got a link in the description. I'll also put a link to Arthur Versluis's New Inquisitions, because there's a lot more in there than I got to today. So check it out. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you like us. Subscribe if you don't like us too, just because why not? And take care. We'll see you later.